Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you, even though I'm coming to you remotely from Bangalore. It's really nice to be able to be part of the Winelands conference. This is one of my favorite parts of the world, especially since Cape Town has just won the Earth Day Capital Awards, something that I was part of as the jury. So very quickly, I'm going to go over for you some of the core challenges that we face and the opportunities that we would like to see around an urban planet, especially focusing on issues of urban innovation in India and the global south. To start with the global context, there is only one Earth, and of course it's in a small corner of the known universe, and that's what we have to actually cope with. The fundamental challenge that we have over this century is the challenge of the sustainability transition. And in the sustainability transition, there are three core challenges that we have. The first one is addressing the question of consumption. Present consumption requires about two worlds to be able to provide at least the ecological products and services that we require. Population growth over this century from about 7 million at the moment to maybe 9 billion plus by the middle of the century will require another 1.5 worlds. And the biggest challenge that we are dealing with in South Asia and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, ending poverty at current throughput would require about 2 times the current world resource availability. So in actual fact, we require about 5.5, 6 times the present consumption, which we clearly know is unsustainable. And unfortunately for us, we only have one world. The sustainability traverse that we're talking about, which has to be played out over the next 30 to 50 years, and certainly over this century, will be largely made functional by what happens in Chinese, Indian, and African cities. And that, I guess, is the great opportunity that we face today as we sit looking at this question. Of course, reality is more complex than we would like it to be. Reality is more complex because it's punctuated by multiple shocks. And if you're looking at some evidence of what's happened over the course of the 20th century, here are two images, one from 1921, and what you can see there on the upper right side is Mount Everest, taken from a famous photograph that Mallory took, and then an image that's about 5 or 6 years old, which looks at the loss of glaciers. So this is one of the most dramatic images of significant environmental change, which anthropogenic processes have actually brought about. So urbanization, in some senses, is both a key opportunity and challenge. But I think what we really have to understand is that urbanization is not just a megatrend, part of the things that we've seen changing over the last 50 or 100 years. It's actually a gigatrend, a millennium transformation of human culture, and that's very important to understand, human society, the economy, polity, and of course planetary systems. So just to give you a sense of how this has played out in the last 100 years or so, in 1900 the population of the world was about 1.3 billion or so. The urban share was about 13%. The gross world product at that point of time was about 2 trillion, and the urban share of that was about 30%. So that's the world in 1900. You can see the bulk of the world's cities, at least the bigger ones, of more than 750,000, are largely concentrated in Europe, in North America, and there are a few dots that you can see in many parts of the world. And then, of course, if we jump to the world at the current point of time, in 2014, about 100 years later, what do we find? The population has risen from 2 billion to 7 billion. The urban share has gone up to about 50%. The gross world product has jumped from 2 trillion to 70 trillion, a jump of about 35 times. And the urban share has gone up to 70%. And if you look at satellite images, and this is something that's become ubiquitous after we've gone into space in the late 1960s, you find that we are a planet where cities in some senses dominate the planetary landscape across the nighttime and the daytime sky. And then if you look a little bit ahead into 2025, what do we find? We find the population goes up to about 8 billion, the urban share goes up to a little over 55%, the gross world product goes up to about 80 trillion, and the urban share goes up even more. But, and look at the numbers and look at the dots across the landscape there's a massive expansion of urbanization in East Asia, primarily in China, in South Asia, and of course in Sub-Saharan West Africa and in parts of Latin America. This is as I said, a gigatrend. This is a millennial shift. We are becoming, in a sense, a global urban civilization with all the positive aspects of being so, but significant challenges that come along with that. So to just sort of summarize this in a single table, let me just take you through those numbers again. You can see there the growth of population from about 1.5 billion in 1900 to 7 billion at the moment, rising to about 8 billion by 2025. The urban share going up from 13% in 1900 to about 50% just now of population in about 2014, and going up to about 58% in 2025. But the most dramatic thing, of course, is the massive growth in the global economy between the 1950s and 2000s, and its continuous growth in the early part of the 21st century. And there again, the urban share rising from about 70% to about 75%. So this is much more of an urban planet in the economic sense than in the population sense, and it is really coping with this tremendous throughput of economic activity, resources, and the sort of negative externalities that have come with it, especially dealing with global environmental change, particularly climate change. I've just come from the closing of the IPCC plenary in Tokyo, and the last week has been really devoted at looking at the tremendous challenges that we have as climate change starts playing itself out, and of course will become something that we really have to seriously contend with in the next 20 or 30 years. If we are not able to adapt dramatically, reduce throughput by factor 2, factor 4 in some economies of the world, then we can see some unalterable shifts over the next 50 to 60 years, which means, of course, once you get into non-linear and irreversible change, we can see processes that may be almost impossible to change for the next few hundred years and potentially for the next millennium. So what's driving this? In some senses, people find it difficult to understand the force and the rapidity of urban transformation. One classic example that one uses from a city that one understands and has spent little time in is Shanghai. So this is Shanghai in 1987, looking from Puxi to Pudong. And then, of course, if we suddenly move maybe 20 plus years into the future, in 2012, this is what it looked like. Exactly the same location, and look at the tremendous transformation. One of the great world cities, a city that now has more skyscrapers than New York, than Manhattan. But of course, the big question sitting behind it is this really sustainable? This may have actually enabled China to grow to become the second largest and potentially the largest economy in the next 10 to 15 years. But it also has had dramatic consequences both for the Chinese environment and, of course, for global consumption and what is sustainable. So I guess the key question is this form of urbanization really sustainable in the long run, and how can we deal with this? There's a big challenge that we're dealing with globally at the current point of time. In about 2 years' time, the United Nations will lay out its agenda for what is called the post-2015 period, that is between 2015 and 2030. We're going to transition from the Millennium Development Goals, which focused on poor people in poor countries, to what we hope will be called the Sustainable Development Goals that will embrace all of humanity. That means rich and poor people from rich and poor countries. And of course, the question for us is, will cities actually find a place in these Sustainable Development Goals? As part of this process, I co-chair an initiative created by the United Nations process, the UNSDSN, which is looking at trying to set up a set of 10 integrated goals. They're up on the screen. The most obvious and important ones, of course, are the question of ending extreme hunger and poverty, extreme poverty and hunger over the next 20 years, achieving development within planetary boundaries. But I think operationally, two of the most significant things that we're looking at is goal 6 and 7, which are in red, and that is how to improve agricultural systems and raise rural prosperity, because the end of poverty, or certainly extreme poverty, can only be done if we're able to improve agricultural systems, to move to more sustainable agricultural practices across the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa in the face of climate change, and of course to raise the quality of life of people in rural areas. But simultaneously, as we've seen, as cities come to dominate the global economy at global, regional and local scales, empowering inclusive, productive and resilient cities is a very important consideration. and in many ways the key driver of enabling this to happen. But the question of addressing rural prosperity and addressing the question of sustainable cities need to be seen as back-to-back, as complementary processes. So within that, over the last year or so, a number of us from across the world have been focusing on trying to lay out what a potential urban sustainable goal for the world, for countries across the world, and of course for cities might actually look like. This is one articulation, and let me read it for you very quickly. Making all cities socially inclusive, economically productive, environmentally sustainable and secure, and resilient to climate change and other risks, which we know will actually deepen over the rest of the century. But to do this, we need to develop participatory, accountable, and effective city governance to enable this rapid and equitable urban transformation that I think we need pretty much across the world, and certainly within sub-Saharan Africa. Because after the first big wave in China and South Asia, the next big opportunity is actually going to come from West and Southern Africa. And as South Africa builds out its own planning processes, its own struggles to address the question of urban sustainability in its metropolitan cities and smaller centers, this is going to become, I guess, a very important challenge, especially because one has to keep the balance between rural and urban areas. So to make this happen, there are sort of three broad targets that we're looking at, three ways to try and operationalize it. The first, of course, is to end extreme urban poverty, to expand employment and productivity, especially in the post-2008 period. Addressing questions of employment and productivity are critical. Addressing the challenges of slums. We have almost a billion people in slums, in spite of having met the Millennium Development Goal targets as far as slums are concerned. We do not want to have another billion people coming into slums over the next 20 or 30 years or so. We need to address this as a priority. And we can do that by ensuring universal access to well-designed, secure, and affordable built environments, and the provision of basic services. And this is not only housing, water and sanitation, and waste management, but also, especially in a 21st century world, access to low carbon energy and transportation systems, and of course ubiquitous mobile and broadband communication systems. And then finally, to address the brown, black and blue and green agendas of environmental change, ensuring safe air and water quality for all, and integrating sustainable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, efficient land and resource use, especially in cities, we can enable climate and disaster resilience and sort of operationalize this process that tries to tackle questions of social, economic, and environmental sustainability. Now, how would this actually look? This is a very quick vignette of an exercise when we try to examine how this might look for the cities of Bangalore and New York City, which work in very different environments. One in India, which is a low middle income country, and of course New York is the center of a lot of innovation in urban areas and of course in urban sustainability. But given the per capita income of the city and its growth, it is a serious challenge there to operationalize sustainability in the long run. This looks at target A, which is looking at poverty, and you can see some similarities and some differences between the cities. And if you look at it in a multidimensional fashion as far as universal access to services are concerned, in many ways New York is much better than Bangalore, but we find that cities in the global south are able to catch up rather quickly, especially if they have access to new technologies, to institutional innovations, and are able to operationalize them rather quickly. And then finally, when we look at questions of environmental sustainability, interestingly, because of the nature of Manhattan, the way that New York is actually built up, you find in questions of urban green cover, in terms of urban biodiversity, there are other cities in the world that might actually be doing significantly better. Cape Town, Durban are interesting examples from South Africa. So this is just a sort of thought experiment of how one might be able to try and operationalize these sustainable development goals at the city level. And it's not only something that can be operationalized at national level. In actual fact, most of the real innovations in urban adaptation that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years or so have actually been led by city level initiatives across the world. And very often, and increasingly so, the most innovation is coming from cities of the south. So if I move from there, to India, which is, as I said, one of the key pivots of this process of transitioning to a more sustainable urban future. Let me just quickly give you, 50 or 60 year sense of the dynamics of Indian urbanization. The numbers, of course, are fairly large, and sometimes they may seem challenging to people from other geographies. But basically, we expect to add about 300 million new people to our cities in the next 30 years. This is on top of the current urban population of about 300 million, of which, most importantly, about 70 million are poor. 3 of the 10 largest megacities in the world will be in India: Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, and Bangalore is actually coming up not so far behind. But the other interesting thing to understand is that there will be 75 other cities that have a population over 1 million. This is going to be the second largest urbanization in human history, which at one end will create huge market opportunities and economic opportunities, but it will be seriously challenged with a whole range of development challenges, whether it's social development or economic development or questions of infrastructure. And in some senses, the only way to avoid a complete systemic urban breakdown, which if you travel to Indian cities seems to be happening on an everyday basis, is the simultaneous transformation of our cities and our villages. And I'll show you in a short while why the linkage between the two is very important, and why the heart of urban innovation in South Asia and potentially in other parts of the world is in trying to keep this balance between larger metropolitan centers, smaller towns, and of course village and town areas around this. So a whole range of technical, institutional, and sort of social innovations will be required to enable this to happen in a real sense. So this is a picture in 1951. The dots in green are basically the million cities, up to about 5 million or so. And then it moves ahead in 1961. You can see the growth of the first 5.7 million city, Kolkata, the former capital of the British Raj. 1971, Mumbai crosses the 5 million mark. 1981, Delhi reaches the 5 million mark. Mumbai is now up to almost 9 million along with Kolkata. In 1991, we find Kolkata and Mumbai simultaneously breaching the megacity or the 10 million barrier, Delhi not far behind it, 8.2, Chennai moving up at 5.3. 2001, Delhi crossing to 12.4 million, Mumbai at 16, Kolkata slowing a little bit at 13.1, and 2 other 5 million cities emerging, Hyderabad and Bangalore. The most recent data from the Indian census, you suddenly find a massive growth. Mumbai almost 20 million people, Delhi coming up very close behind at about 17 million, Kolkata at about 16 million, Chennai and Bangalore at about 7.5 million each, and Hyderabad coming up. And of course, the most interesting thing is the growth of smaller urban centers, 1 to 5 million in green, and a whole range of other centers across that. And suddenly, I guess if you look at the 2011 numbers, we have 3 cities with a population of over 10 million, 3 megacities, 53 cities which are million cities. But, and this is very important to understanding where we need to go, 833 million people in India live in about 0.64 million villages. I'll repeat that again, 640,000 villages. The 377 urban Indians live in about 8,000 urban centers, which means that there is almost a 2 order of magnitude difference between the number of urban centers and the number of villages. So if we jump into the future, and this is just a sort of medium run projection for 2031, you find a massive growth of urban centers across the Indian subcontinent. But unlike what it may seem from the outside, India is still predominantly a rural country. So if I were really to show you the 500,000 or more villages in 2031, the entire face of this image would actually be black. So I guess we are talking about a dramatic urban transformation, but more than the numbers and the economic figures, the real challenge for us is really a cultural challenge. The core challenge of contemporary Indian urbanization is the integration of the pre-colonial, and we've had 5,000-year urban history, the colonial, which defines a lot of the core area of many of our large megacities, the modern, which you can see in towards the sort of background of this particular image, and of course the informal, which permeates our cities, and you can't see here, but is a very important part of the fabric that we have. So if we were to look at all the settlements in India. This is something that I think many other parts of the world should actually do as a thought exercise. What we find, of course, is a tremendously long tail distribution where the bulk of the settlements, or the bulk of the settlement structure, is in hamlets, small villages and medium-sized villages which have less than maybe 2,000 to 5,000 people inside them. The cities are actually a very, very small part of that overall frame. So if I were to look at India's settlement structure, and this is a plot that explores it from 1951 to 2001, what it shows you is that there's a dramatic shift in the proportion of small centers, and urbanization itself is growing relatively slowly compared to other parts of the world at sort of India or South Asia's current level of development. The contention that many of us have is because we have so many villages, or we have a very decentralized settlement structure, there is a great opportunity that South Asia has to actually move to a much more sustainable form of production and consumption, one that balances a relatively large proportion of our population that would live in villages based on sustainable agriculture, green production, etc. Maybe 15 to maybe 30%, depending on how much food security you can expect in a subcontinent which has almost 2 billion people. India itself will have about 1.5 billion people in 2051. And of course then a mix of services and manufacturing. So the balance between the three is, I think, the most important question, and being able to provide for infrastructure and the growth of manufacturing, especially in smaller centers, and critically green manufacturing, is going to be the core challenge that Indian urbanization is going to face over the next 20 or 30 years. So you can see here about 60% of India's GDP comes from urban areas, even though about 31% of our population lives in cities. There's going to be a significant structural shift that we expect between employment in agriculture, which is currently has a large proportion of people who are largely underemployed, and cities in which there is a tremendous amount of concentration of economic activity and output. So India's top 100 cities in 2011, and again let me give you that number again, the top 100 cities out of 600 and let's say 50,000 places, these top 100 cities produced 43% of India's economic output, with 16% of its population in less than 0.24% of its land area. So you can see the dramatic economic concentration that we're challenged with. So at one end, there's a tremendous opportunity for decentralized production and consumption, something that actually matches the challenges of the 21st century, renewable energy, decentralized water and soil management, and being able to not move large numbers of people around, because that consumes a considerable amount of resources and fossil energy. So the interesting operational challenge that we have in economic terms is that the urban informal sector, which makes up about 25% of India's employment, produces about 26% of India's GDP. And the urban formal sector, which is what one looks at when one is looking at images of India's great sort of global engagement with the IT sector in Bangalore, the city that I spend a lot of my time in. The urban formal sector in India only produces, with 5% of its employment, only produces 25% of our GDP. So in terms of economic output, the urban informal sector produces almost equal share of output as the urban formal sector. This is a very interesting operational challenge. This is something that I think South Africa is going to, or is currently struggling with. How does one actually provide for large numbers of young people who are looking for jobs in an environment in which very few formal sector jobs are actually being provided and created? And along with that, there is this deadly problem of trying to address the reproduction of poverty and inequality. This is a very central question, not only an economic question, but a social and a political question. So this is just a quick graph that look at asymmetry in Indian rural populations and Indian urban populations, and what we see is, unlike the theory of the sort of melting pot that we've heard in many parts of the world, urban India is also reproducing the same social hierarchy, and in India the question of social exclusion for what we call scheduled castes and other scheduled populations is a very serious one. we need to address it if this is not going to become a very critical social issue. In fact, politically it's probably one of the most central issues along with jobs that we face in our cities. So the challenge of contemporary India and of this urban transformation in many parts of the global south is that 9 or 10 things are happening simultaneously in a period of 20 to 50 years. There is a demographic transition that's happening along with a health transition and an educational transition where millions of young people are actually coming in through an educational system and are looking for jobs. There are energy transitions that are happening. There's an environmental transition that's happening simultaneously. The green, brown agendas are actually transitioning in each of our cities at the same time. There's an information revolution. India now is the largest growing market for sort of cell phone growth in the world. There's a livelihood transition from an agrarian to an urban post-industrial culture happening at the same time. And of course, is a political transition from centralized top-down systems which have a strong sort of believe strongly in planning to a much more decentralized youth and urban-based system. And the thing that sort of wraps this around, and brings it together is the transition from rural agrarian cultures to urban transformation around a range of processes that we're just getting to understand and get a sense of. So as far as we're concerned in India, this leads to 5 critical national development goals. The first is to end poverty and reduce inequality by the 2030s. To enable this, we need to have inclusive economic growth. To underpin this, environmental sustainability is absolutely central. The key driver of this will not be the economic transformation, though economics is very important. The key question, of course, is the social transformation, which deals with the asymmetry of caste, of gender, of ethnicity, and of building a more equal society. And for that, you require unified and robust polities. So we need to do all these 5 things in our cities and urban areas, and of course in the Indian economic and political system over the next 20 odd years to make this happen. So what are the key barriers to systemic innovation in urban India? The first, in my opinion, and this is something that's not articulated very clearly, is the question of gender inclusion. This underpins everything that we see. In fact, as women take a more equal role in Indian society, in the Indian workforce, in actually enabling the delivery of much more equitable services, in sort of reorganizing governance, I think we're going to see a very different future. That is starting to happen, but of course it's deeply contested. And then of course the question of dealing with exclusion on the basis of caste, class and community, a big question which is going much slower than we expected it to be. The sort of founders of the first Indian Republic had a sense that we would have addressed these questions in the first 20 or 30 years after independence in 1947. We are still a long way to go as far as that's concerned. And then of course the hegemony of place and of birth are very strong. And I think cities are going to give us a place to be able to try and explore this. One of the core challenges in this process of enabling systemic innovation is the hollowing out of institutional capacities and neutral places for engagement. And I would imagine South Africa is going through similar kind of challenges 20 years after the transition. This is something that is very critical for India to enable this transformative processes to take root, because it is institutions and people within them who enable the processes of sort of systemic innovation. So to lay out, 2 broad sort of stylized frames of how innovation happened in the past, and in a sense, this is a frame that was used, I would imagine, in the 1950s and 60s when India was flush, like South Africa was, with the joy and so the hope of a new beginning after independence, very strongly based on the state, with the family and faith being quite important, the private sector and firms being less important, and the academia being closely allied to the state, but being somewhat separate from the process. And then in the 2000s, a significant set of challenges, the role of the firm becoming very important as economic growth and development start becoming quite critical, the role of the state shrinking, the academy becoming less connected with the state, but strongly so with the private sector, losing some of its independence, the role of the family being important, that is of faith actually shrinking, but new areas of sort of overlap and contest emerging. This is something that we have to look at quite carefully, because one understanding of each of these domains and how they relate to each other is very critical to being able to articulate a theory of change and processes that will actually work in a systemic sense. And I think each culture and each society has to be able to examine these questions in both urban and rural areas, in their multiple geographies, and examining that in multiple ways in which they engage with the process of globalization to get a sense of how things may actually work in the future. And then finally, a stylized, the innovation cycle as far as India is concerned. The primary focus, because we are a country that's still very poor, a low middle income country, is for most people, especially the poorest, to survive. And they do that by adapting, and our systems are very effective at adapting to serious constraint. Once we've been able to adapt, of course, we take innovation that comes both from the inside and the outside, absorb it into the mainstream system. Occasionally, every 15 or 20 years, there may be a bout of significant transformation, either within a sector or particular cities. And then, of course, the system freezes again, and you're back with trying to survive the way that it emerges. So, as I said, this is a stylized way of trying to look at it. There may be other ways to actually articulate and represent this, but I think this may be an interesting way for you to engage with the question of innovation in the context of the global south. This looks rather different from what you may see from conventional innovation theory that comes in from other places. But of course, at the end of the day, the key question is, who's actually going to do it? We have to build tens of thousands of institutions to be able to enable our 10,000 to 15,000 urban centers to make this transition possible. Effectively, we have to focus on a few hundred of them, let's say 400 to 500, because the bulk of the innovation and the bulk of the change will be worked out there. But we have a serious challenge. At the current point of time, for a population of 1.25 billion, with a third living in urban areas, we have very few people who can enable this change. So if you look at the people who manage the system, as I said, of 1.25 billion people, there are less than about 20,000 people who manage it from the top. And as far as cities are concerned, the biggest challenge, the reason why our cities are in a sense falling apart and being challenged in their everyday life, is that the middle management cadres, as far as cities are concerned, are less than 15,000. So the fundamental challenge that we face in the next 15 to 20 years is to train a completely new cadre, a new set of professionals, of change makers, of political leaders, of civil society leaders, who can actually enable us to make this transition, whether it's in the private sector, in public systems, in the cooperative system, or in civil society. And that is a real challenge, because our higher education sector and the bulk of our knowledge institutions have not been able to do this systemically in the last 2 or 3 decades. So we're trying quite hard through a new initiative, and that's a process that my colleagues and I are leading at the moment. It's called the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. We are creating India's first independent national research and innovation university focused on our urban transformation. This is a huge gamble. It's a difficult process, which is about 4.5 years into its functioning. It's still not completely through with its birth pangs, but the idea basically is, and it's a radical idea, is that you can use a knowledge institution, that you can use a university to seed and catalyze a process of transformative change, which will involve many hundreds of millions of people, and in the long run actually not only transform the Indian landscape, but hopefully provide both inspiration and process to transform cities in South Asia, and by example and by exchange and partnership, cities in other parts of the world. So we're building a national scale institution focused on interdisciplinary excellence with social and economic inclusion as a central process. The idea is, as we say, if we fail, we might train 50,000 people on campus in the next 20 years. This is a sort of deeply innovative institutional design, and of course we are working with the Indian government and the state government in the city that we are to enable the institution to be built and to scale out. And effectively, and I said, we might find how we've actually done in this maybe in 10 years' time, to build a transformative national institution. We need to go out and launch similar experiments at scale, because the challenge of transformative urbanization is to be able to effect a radical set of transitions across multiple dimensions in the next 20 or 30 years. We really have a very narrow window of opportunity to enable the sustainability transformation in the next 20 or 30 years. And people and institutions are going to be at the heart of this. And I hope you will join us and many other people who are working towards this end in the world to make this possible. Thanks very much, and I hope you have a wonderful conference.